Thornwick was the kind of place that felt both timeless and isolating, with its cobblestone streets, ivy-covered cottages, and the towering presence of St. Michael's Church. For most, it was a peaceful sanctuary nestled on the English coast, but for Clara Hughes, it was a prison. Clara had married young, swept up by the charm of David Hughes, an ambitious banker. But as his career demanded more and more of his time, Clara found herself alone in Thornwick's quiet corners, craving warmth, attention, and something to remind her she was still alive. It was during one of these lonely afternoons that she found herself drawn to St. Michael's. Clara had never been particularly religious, but there was something about the solemnity of the old church that soothed her restlessness. She sat in the pews, her thoughts drifting, when Father Michael Keating's gaze fell upon her from across the sanctuary. Tall, with piercing eyes and a gentle smile, he approached her, curious yet respectful. "Are you all right, Mrs. Hughes?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a warmth that immediately put her at ease. Clara looked up, surprised anyone had noticed her sadness. "Oh, yes," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just finding some peace." Father Michael nodded, lingering for a moment. "Sometimes it helps to speak with someone, even if it's just to get things off your chest." From that day, Clara found herself returning to the church more often, drawn not only by the tranquility, but by the quiet strength of Father Michael. In him, she saw a figure who listened without judgment, someone who genuinely cared for her well-being. Her visits grew more frequent, each conversation pushing the boundaries between confession and connection. She found herself telling him things she'd never admitted to anyone, things that made her feel both vulnerable and empowered. One chilly autumn evening, Clara stayed longer than usual after a service, and Father Michael invited her to his private quarters to continue their conversation. The air was thick with anticipation as she stepped into his dimly lit room, the scent of candle wax and old wood filling her senses. They spoke for hours, their words weaving a tapestry of understanding and unspoken attraction. And then, without warning, he reached out, his hand brushing hers, a spark igniting between them. "Clara," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. We can't." But she didn't pull away, and neither did he. Their restraint crumbled as desire overpowered reason, and they surrendered to each other in that quiet room, the centuries-old walls bearing witness to their forbidden passion. For Clara, this was more than just an affair. It was a liberation. She had felt more alive in those moments than she had in years of marriage. Over the weeks, their trysts became a regular escape. They met in shadowed corners of the village, exchanged furtive glances during Sunday services, and even risked stolen moments in Clara's own home. Each encounter was tinged with the thrill of secrecy, a dance between desire and danger. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. Yet, the secrecy began to gnaw at her. Clara knew her husband was no fool. David had noticed her absences, the distant look in her eyes, the way she seemed to drift further from him with each passing day. One evening, after a rare dinner together, he confronted her. "Clara, what's going on?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. "You've been acting strange for months now, and don't tell me it's just church." She hesitated, her heart pounding. "I've been struggling, David, with loneliness, with us. I've found comfort in the church." "Comfort," he repeated, narrowing his eyes. "In the church or in someone?" Clara's silence was answer enough. David didn't say another word, but his jaw clenched, and she could see the fury simmering beneath the surface. She knew she'd lost whatever trust they'd once shared. From that moment, David was on high alert. He began watching her closely, questioning her every movement, every reason for leaving the house. When he caught her sneaking out one evening, she knew she couldn't hide anymore. He demanded answers, and she told him she was going to see Father Michael for spiritual counseling, carefully masking the truth. But the look in David's eyes told her he didn't believe a word of it. In his desperation to uncover the truth, David hired a private investigator. Clara had no idea, of course, as she continued her affair with Father Michael, wrapped up in the thrill of her newfound freedom. The investigator followed her to the church, to shadowed alleyways, even capturing compromising photographs of her with Father Michael. It didn't take long for the investigator to bring back damning evidence. David's suspicions were not only confirmed, but exceeded his worst fears. He held in his hands photos of his wife in the arms of a man who was supposed to be her spiritual guide. The betrayal tore through him, igniting a rage he could barely contain. But rather than confronting her immediately, David plotted his revenge. He decided he would expose her shame and destroy Father Michael in a way neither of them could recover from. It would be public, humiliating, and final. He waited for the perfect moment, a charity event at St. Michael's where nearly every resident of Thornwick would be gathered. Meanwhile, Clara remained blissfully unaware of the trap that was closing in around her. The more time she spent with Father Michael, the more convinced she was that she had found her true happiness. She dreamed of leaving Thornwick, starting a new life with him, far from David's judgmental gaze and the small-town gossip that seemed to cling to her every move. But Father Michael was more cautious. As much as he cared for Clara, he knew the risk they were taking. His position in the community, his very identity, hinged on discretion. Clara's willingness to abandon everything unnerved him, and a seed of doubt began to grow within him. Could he really trust her to keep their secret? Was she truly as devoted to him as she claimed, or was he just an escape for her disillusionment? The night of the charity event finally arrived. The church was filled with villagers, all there to support the fundraiser and enjoy the evening's entertainment. Clara sat in the front pew, her gaze fixed on Father Michael, who stood at the altar delivering an impassioned speech. David, meanwhile, was lurking near the back, clutching the evidence that would shatter both of their lives. As Father Michael's speech reached its peak, David stepped forward, seizing the opportunity to unveil his shocking proof. But as he made his move, Clara's heart sank. She recognized the look on David's face, the cold determination in his eyes. In that instant, she knew he had discovered everything, and a shiver of fear ran down her spine. The church fell into silence as David addressed the congregation, his voice laced with venom. "It seems our beloved priest here has been offering more than just spiritual guidance." He held up the incriminating photos for all to see, the congregation gasping in shock and horror. Father Michael's face paled, and Clara felt her world collapse. She had no time to react, no time to escape. The judgmental eyes of Thornwick were upon her, and the weight of her choices crashed down like a tidal wave. After David's explosive revelation at the charity event, the atmosphere in Thornwick changed. Clara felt the weight of shame every time she left her home. Whispers followed her through the narrow streets, judgmental eyes bore into her back, and neighbors she'd once considered friends now crossed to the other side of the road when they saw her coming. Father Michael, too, faced the wrath of the village. Parishioners abandoned St. Michael's in droves, condemning the man they had once revered. But as the weeks passed, a strange transformation took hold of Clara. Her guilt was overshadowed by anger at David for orchestrating her public humiliation, and anger at Father Michael for retreating from her after the scandal. She had been ready to leave everything behind for him, but now she felt abandoned, left to shoulder the blame alone. Yet, despite her anger, Clara found herself drawn back to Father Michael, clinging to him as the one person who still understood her. One cold November night, Clara sought out Father Michael in his secluded cottage on the outskirts of Thornwick. The church had stripped him of his title, and he now lived in isolation, a shadow of his former self. When Clara arrived, he seemed almost broken, but the sight of her rekindled a spark in his eyes. They spoke in hushed voices, sharing their mutual resentment toward David, who had orchestrated their downfall. The conversation grew heated, their shared anger reaching a boiling point, until, in a moment of impulsive madness, Father Michael whispered, "Perhaps there's a way to be free of him, once and for all." Clara's heart raced. She knew what he was suggesting, but the gravity of his words terrified her. Yet, a darker part of her felt a thrill, a vision of life without David, a life where she and Father Michael could finally be together without fear or judgment. They sat in silence, letting the unspoken plan settle between them. As the minutes passed, their resolve hardened. They knew there was no going back. The next day they began plotting. The plan was simple yet brutal. David would be lured to a remote location under the guise of reconciliation. Father Michael, using a burner phone, would send David messages claiming to be Clara, begging for forgiveness and suggesting a secret meeting in the forest. Clara's task was to leave a trail of hints to make it believable. They decided to meet David at nightfall, where he would be vulnerable, alone, and unprepared. But as the day approached, Clara's nerves frayed. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, haunted by the weight of what they were about to do. She was torn between a gnawing guilt and a desperate desire for freedom. Father Michael, on the other hand, seemed calm, almost disturbingly so. It was as if he had slipped into a role that fit him too easily, a man willing to cross any line to satisfy his desires. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something dark and twisted within him that had been waiting for this moment all along. The night of the plan came, cold and misty, with a thick fog settling over Thornwick. Clara and Father Michael waded in the shadowed depths of the forest, the silence around them punctuated only by the distant rustling of leaves. At last, they saw the faint glow of a flashlight moving through the trees, David cautiously making his way toward the meeting point. As he stepped into the clearing, Clara felt a surge of panic. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I can go through with this." Father Michael grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "It's too late for second thoughts, Clara. This is the only way." With a last resigned nod, Clara stepped back, her body rigid as Father Michael emerged from the shadows, his face concealed by a hood. David looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "Who?" he started, but he had no time to react. Father Michael lunged forward, brandishing a heavy wrench, and struck David across the head with a sickening thud. David staggered, blood streaming down his face, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "Michael, stop!" Clara cried. But Father Michael was relentless, his rage erupting with each brutal swing. When he finally stopped, David lay motionless on the ground, his body battered and unrecognizable. Clara stared in horror, unable to process the brutality she had just witnessed. But there was no time for grief or guilt. They quickly set to work, wiping down the area for any trace of evidence. They dragged David's body deeper into the forest, burying him beneath a pile of rocks and dirt, hoping the desolate location would keep their secret safe. In the days that followed, Clara found herself slipping into a state of numbness. She went through the motions, pretending to mourn her husband's sudden disappearance, all the while haunted by memories of that night in the forest. Father Michael, however, seemed eerily at ease, confident they had left no trace. He assured her repeatedly that they were in the clear, that no one would ever discover the truth. But Thornwick's police were persistent. David's disappearance raised suspicion, and the small village buzzed with rumors. An investigation was launched, with officers questioning Clara about her husband's last known whereabouts. She did her best to play the grieving widow, feigning tears and recounting the fabricated story of David's supposed departure for a work trip. For a while it seemed to work, until a hiker stumbled upon the makeshift grave in the forest. The news of David's body shook Thornwick to its core. The investigation intensified, and detectives combed through every possible lead. It wasn't long before the burner phone was traced back to a shop where Father Michael's face had been captured on a surveillance camera. Detectives confronted Clara, whose fragile demeanor began to crack under pressure. When questioned about her connection to Father Michael, her answers faltered, and the police grew suspicious. As the evidence mounted, Clara realized the web was closing in on them. In a desperate attempt to save herself, she went to Father Michael, begging him to leave Thornwick with her, to flee before they were discovered. But Father Michael's demeanor had changed. Cold and detached, he looked at her with a smirk. "Oh, Clara," he murmured, his tone laced with contempt. "Did you really think I would give up everything for you?" The words hit her like a blow. She saw in that moment the truth, that Father Michael had used her as a pawn, feeding her desperation and insecurities to serve his own dark purposes. The man she thought she loved was nothing more than a manipulative predator, willing to discard her now that the walls were closing in. Realizing she was alone, Clara made a desperate choice. She confessed everything to the police, laying out their twisted plan and her role in it. Her confession was enough to secure her arrest, but it also gave detectives the leverage they needed to confront Father Michael. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and after hours of interrogation, he finally broke, coldly recounting the details of the crime. The trial was swift and merciless. The entire village watched as Father Michael was sentenced to life in prison, his once revered reputation now reduced to ashes. Clara, too, faced a harsh sentence, her life irrevocably shattered by the choices she had made. In the aftermath, Thornwick tried to return to its quiet existence, but the scars remained. The church, once a place of solace, stood empty, a reminder of the darkness that had unfolded within its walls. And as for Clara, she spent her days haunted by the price of her obsession, knowing that she had paid with everything she once held dear.